Good morning or good afternoon, whatever time it is you're watching this video. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and to my basement. For this week's video, I want to go through another layout design. This is actually a layout design that I did some time ago, but before I had a chance to create the video, I just got swamped with other work. I just never got a moment to create that video. So now I'm going to take some time out of my schedule to readdress that issue. I hope you enjoy the design.
Here is the site plan, the customer's training room. It's an attic room. It has a pair of windows at one end. It has protrusions at both ends. I think they're chimney breasts, but he didn't say what they were. The stairs come up in the middle of one side. There's a knee wall at this location, 36 inches high, which he didn't want to remove, so the layout has to come over the top of that. And it is for an HO scale layout. Now, overall, the layout space is approximately 27 feet by 15, although not all of it is full standing headroom. There's about 3 feet along each side, which is less than standing headroom because of the attic location. And of course, there's obstructions at both ends and one side. So there is only one long straight wall. That's over here, at the top of the plan. Now, this customer is probably in the minority as far as my regular customers are concerned, in that he seemed to have realistic expectations as to how much railroad he could fit in the space. And I commend him for that. But then, in common with virtually every client that I work with, he didn't really have any idea of how best to use that space, which is, generally speaking, why people hire me to design their railroads for them. Now, the customer's want list included the ability to run large steam and early diesels, and also some heavyweight passenger cars. He didn't want to follow any particular prototype, but he wanted to be able to operate prototypically using car cards and waybills. He wanted a single track main line with branch lines. He wanted a continuous loop for display running. He wanted a small yard, a harbour, minimal engine service facilities, an interchange, logging and mining operations. He wanted mountains, bridges and trestles. He was in agreement with me that keeping aisles to at least 3 feet is highly desirable. And since this attic room is a shared space with his wife to store all her Christmas decorations, he wanted to make sure there's plenty of room to store them under the railroad without being cramped as far as getting them out. He wanted plenty of open scenery so that his very artistic daughter would have an opportunity to help him build it. So I like the way he's bringing his family into the hobby. His original suggestions were for a 26-inch mainline radius and 22-inch on the branch line, although I increased that because he wanted to run the big steam and passenger cars. So I suggested that we keep to at least a 30-inch minimum. Now, since he already has a large box of track, he wanted me to use the Peco Code 100 range. I'll get back to that later, but for now, the relevant factor is that their curved turnout has a radius of 28 3/4 inches on the inside track. So it seems sensible to make that the minimum for the railroad. Although I did end up with a much wider radius on most of the mainline curves. Now, because of the attic space, the layout has to be built a lot lower than would be normal. He envisioned track elevations between 36 and 43 inches, with operation being primarily from an office chair. And then he suggested that there should be a second scenic deck across this end, where his mining and logging operations would be. But he didn't have any idea how to get there, because clearly a helix would have to be more or less on the centre line of the room, otherwise it's not going to fit. Now, he envisaged the layout as being an independently owned branch line interchanging with a Class 1 railroad on the main line. And something else on his must-have list was a tall, curved wooden trestle. And he sent some preliminary plans that he had drawn, and he wanted to build his trestle scene right opposite the stairs, so that it would be the first scene that people would see as they came in. But unfortunately, that breaks up the only long wall of the room, and therefore the only sensible location for a yard. So now that we have an idea of the space and what the customer wants to put in it, let's start drawing some plans. This is the first idea sketch I drew. It shows a folded dog bone with 30-inch radius curves at both ends, and the curved trestle seam being moved to a location beside the stairs, with its harbour branch line the other side. It means there is one short, tight aisle in this location, but everywhere else is at least 3 feet, and in some cases I ended up with 4-foot aisles, allowing plenty of room for his wife to get her Christmas decorations in and out. Here's another variation when instead of folding back on itself, I just cut across the head of the stairs. The harbour could be in the same location, but there's more space for it now because we don't have this turn back curve in this corner. And then the trestle will now be on a branch line instead of on the main. And then the third version of that was, instead of going around the end of the stairs, to cut across them, because at this point there's enough headroom to just walk under without having to bend down. So I presented these 3 rough designs to the customer, and he decided that he liked number 2 the best. Just wrapping around the room once and then around the edge of the stairs on a swing gate. He did mention that he might want to simplify the carpentry by making it a straightforward lift out instead of a swing gate, but I felt that it was best to keep it as a swing gate so that when it's closed it can also double as a safety fence to stop operators from falling down the stairs when they're concentrating on the trains rather than where they're walking. And after I mentioned that, he agreed with me and we decided to keep it as a swing gate. And this arrangement remained right up until the final drawing. Here I started filling in some details. It gives an idea of the scope that is possible in the harbour area, how I'm going to get to the trestle scene, where a helix can go to get to the second shelf at this end, and how a staging area can be wrapped around in this corner. Now, it won't be convenient to get in there during operation, so it's basically just for parking trains, and he'll need to make sure that his track work in this area is totally reliable and clean so that he doesn't have stalling issues. And most likely a pair of cameras to monitor trains in this area would be desirable as well. But until now, he hadn't thought that it would be possible to get a staging yard into his space, especially as the space under the benchwork has to be kept open for his wife's Christmas decorations. This track just shows 5 staging tracks. We talked about the possibility of increasing it, and he agreed with me. The more staging tracks the better, provided he keeps enough open space for access in this location. As long as there's at least 2 feet of open space, then more tracks is better. And since I'd already decided that I wanted to cut the benchwork back in this location a bit anyway, there was plenty of room to put in a few more tracks. I think I went with 8 eventually. And here's an idea of what will fit on the upper deck. The main line just comes out of the helix to his mining town, and then a switchback to the logging camp. And this of course will be the highest track elevation directly above the helix at around 62 inches, with the rest of the upper deck being at 60 inches, which he felt was the optimum height with the roof lines being the way they were. Here is the main level with a lot more detail fleshed in. I've increased the staging yard from 5 tracks to 8. See how I've moved this benchwork back just a little bit, and we've still got comfortably more than 2 feet of access in this location. In actual fact, there is room for 1 more staging track and still maintain the 2 feet. I've given an indication of the scope of the yard that is possible. Now, the thing I don't like about the Peco Code 100 turnouts that he wanted to use, they're not done the way we normally do it in this country, with crossing angles like typically number 6 and number 8 as in their Code 83 range. Although they have 3 different radii of turnout, they all have the same 12-degree crossing angle, which approximately equates to a number 5. So even the long turnouts are not really good for crossovers. However, he did say that he was okay with incorporating a few Shinohara number 8s. So I've done that. I used one at this end, I used a pair for the intermediate crossover, and on later drawings I eventually put one in at this junction with the branch line as well, because it looked better there. Now, this intermediate crossover allows these industries on this side to be switched by the same railroad company that runs the main line, whereas the rest of the yard and the industries over this side will be switched by the company that runs the branch lines. And I've kept the junction for the harbour branch within yard limits at this location, while at the other end the second branch line leaves the other side of the river valley, forcing the branch line trains to intrude on the main line for a short distance, just to add a little bit more interest. And making this a fairly deep valley with a substantial trestle across it justifies its shared use. And if we take a look at the route of the main line around here, it's level at 38 inches all the way around, and all the main line curves are at least 36 inches and in most cases 42 or better. The only place where the main line radius drops below that is in the staging yard, where we've had to use a lot of curved turnouts to make it fit. And although this arrangement would not be a good idea on a classification yard, it works okay for staging, where all you're doing is parking trains. You're not doing a lot of switching on the curve, because automatic couplers tend not to work very well in sharp curves like we have here. So as I say, okay for parking trains, not for switching. Now I redrew the harbour using 3 curved turnouts on the approaches, which gained a lot more space, and I was able to make space for a car float, which I didn't think was going to be possible originally. If we go back to the previous drawing, we can see that there's no indication of being able to do that. And he very much liked the idea of including a car float. Now I deliberately kept the yard fairly modest so that it's not overwhelming the layout, but it still does have all the necessary functions. I have a good length yard lead at one end, which can be extended by running a short distance down the harbour branch if he needs to. The other end, there's a short yard lead, which is enough for switching shortcuts of cars at this end, although most of the classification will be done from this end here. Then there's a short run round, a double-ended caboose track, and I've put in 2 tracks for engine service, although I haven't yet designed his engine servicing facilities in detail yet. And also I've no idea what the industries are going to end up looking like. At this point he hadn't given me the list, so at the moment there's just a few spurs for placeholders. And the main line behind the yard doubles as a through passenger track with a short stub track facing each way. But the one at this end would be used to park a short combine, which would be used on the mixed trains up the branch to provide passenger service for the miners. And this end he'd be used a rail car. He mentioned that he had a doodlebug that he wanted to use, and that would be his local mainline service. I later joined these 2 tracks together into a loop. Although it can still be used as 2 stub tracks, you have more flexibility, and you can also park mail and express cars in the middle of the track and switch them from either end. Here we have the track elevation shown. As I mentioned earlier, the mainline circuit is flat at 38 inches, so it'd been about 2 inches over this obstruction, so there's no difficulties with getting the benchwork over it. And I've shown camera locations where they can best fit to monitor the staging yard properly. Okay, here is the main deck in its final glory. I added a short extra spur in the staging yard to park his doodlebug on. Now I believe these rail cars were single-ended and had to be turned at both ends of their run. So what he'll have to do is find a driving trailer for it so that it can be reversed. And then that would run a shuttle service from staging and terminate at the main yard. And I've also got an elevator station on the city viaduct across behind the harbour town. This was something we had discussed throughout the design process, and it was a scene that he really liked the idea of, with the elevated main line crossing it behind the harbour, and industrial spurs running underneath it, and an elevator station. And he loved the way this ended up. I must admit I'm quite pleased with it too. And then at the end of the scene, we dive through a short tunnel through a rock outcrop, just to divide it off from the scenic section beyond it. And at the other end of the same scene, we just disappear into buildings, and then the swing gate becomes just a semi-scenic plank. We've got a nice open area for his daughter to exercise her artistic talents on. The 2 chimney breasts at either end I've just disguised by heavily wooded rock outcrops. That's probably the best way to minimise their impact. And so they're a little bit different. The one at this end, I've also extended a retaining wall all the way from the tunnel across in front of the chimney breast, just to give the scenery a little more variety. And then we have a second big swath of open scenery at this end, so his daughter has more than enough space to showcase her skills in. He did ask that I make this main town look like part of a larger city rather than just a small town. So what I've done is put the passenger station over the tracks, giving it the appearance of a much more important station, a long continuous row of building flats, and some heavy industry in this corner. So all the way from here around the corner and most of the long wall is a solid row of city structures, giving the impression of a fairly large city beyond. He gave me his industry list. He wanted a grain elevator. I've actually put two in here on the same spur, a modern concrete one and an old wooden one. I'm thinking that maybe one of the old wooden ones burnt down and was replaced by a more modern structure. He wanted to incorporate the Walthers Medusa cement, so here it is. He wanted a fuel dealer with a small warehouse, oil storage tanks and a coal trestle all on the same spur. I have a scrapyard, which is a great front of the layout industry because there's no tall structures to reach over. And of course it's easy to build, can use any shaped space and produces some really cool looking freight car loads. And I've had the track disappearing off the front to make it appear that it goes further. I found room to add a rip track, which not only is a great place to park bad order cars until you have time to repair them, but is also a good addition to operation. I've still got the short run round and the double-ended caboose track exactly as I showed on the previous plan, but I've changed the engine service facilities quite significantly. I've shown a small roundhouse with a filled-in turntable pit. There wasn't room for a complete turntable at this point, but since he wants to run Shays and other geared steamers on the branch line, as well as big steam and early diesels on the main, we're thinking that with the advent of the first generation diesels, there was no need for the Class 1 company to maintain a turntable here, because any local turn that terminates at this yard could be diesel hauled. And since there's no way to turn locomotives at the other end of either of the branch lines, there's no benefit to the branch line company for having the turntable. So it's a lot cheaper just to fill it in and replace it with a single turnout to save a lot of maintenance. And we're going to argue that the branch line company decided that 2 stalls was plenty for servicing their locomotives. The third stall is now just a machine shop, and it can be cut open along the fascia to display the interior, as is the fuel dealer's warehouse at this point. I've also shown how in a couple of places industrial spurs can head into buildings and through the backdrop to give more capacity than would otherwise appear. I've done it at this point and again behind the harbour. This backdrop has been brought forward because there would be no way to conveniently reach into that back corner anyway. And I've shown the mainline trestle as a steel trestle to contrast with his tall curved wood trestle on the branch line. Both branch lines have a minimum radius of 26 inches, again more than the 22 that he originally asked for, although it does drop down to 22 inches on the logging line. Let's go to that now. Here is the upper deck. Obviously in an attic space it's very restricted. It can't go all the way to the end because we run out of headroom. At this point the ceiling is only 4 inches above the track, so that really is as far as we can go, and at this end we have a little bit more space. He asked me to put in the mine supply and general store and a mining town. He liked the scene that I built on Brian's layout a couple of years ago in California with his mining town. And I also added an extra spur in here. I put a stock pen on it. The rationale for that is at the higher elevations there's a few ranchers that move their cattle to lower pastures during the winter, and although we're getting to the point where most of that traffic would now be taken by road, we can still run a few stock cars if you want to, and then the rest of the year this spur would just be an extra storage track for the mine use. And then in the mining camp I've added a supply track in addition to the 2 log loading tracks, and another switching location here, a pulpwood loading spur, because pulpwood produces some really good loads too. So now we have two contrasting load types on the logging line. And I've shown a stream winding its way around most of the length of the upper deck. And since it's fairly close to track level, it gives an excuse for thinning down the benchwork somewhat, not having to waste space with a deep fascia where we really don't have a lot of height available, while still allowing the impression of being in the mountains. And as I mentioned earlier, most of the upper deck trackage is at 60 inch elevation, with the logging line rising to 62.5 just to clear the top of the helix, with the water elevation being only a few scale feet below track level all the way around. Anyway, I think that is about it for this layout. I am just going to sign off here. Hope you enjoyed the presentation and got something useful out of it, and I hope to see you again next week. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.